So there's been a lot of opinions circulating about the Ukraine conflict, and we're going to start with this BBC article about students accusing a lecturer of sharing Russian war lives. So this is a bit weird because we've got researchers at universities who are researching disinformation, who are talking about disinformation, who are subject to potentially of defamation from BBC defamation, who are then, and so there's this constant circle, and it's quite hard to work out what's going on. So we're going to unravel a little bit about what's happening here.
So are you saying they're being defamed by the BBC? Or
I am saying they might be being defamed. I would obviously not make a declarative statement on that sort of question.
Right.
But we'll get into it. So if we look at this article, so students accuse lecturer of sharing Russia war lives, and this is the student they choose for the cover.
You said she was fit.
No, we'll get to that.
Get
to that. This is the student they could choose for the cover. Should we have a quick look at her? So can you
I
see what she's
thought this
got?
was just your type.
How dare you? Can you see what she's got around her neck?
Some adipose tissue.
Apart from that.
Oh, it's a dick.
It's a very small dick. No, that's a child's dummy.
Oh, right. Oops.
So I'm not going to talk about any of her concerns because she's wearing a dummy around her neck, and I don't think you should listen to anyone who's wearing a dummy around their neck as a grown adult, quite frankly, unless, they're a mother and there are these extenuating circumstances and blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's the case here. Now, let's scroll down to the next picture in this article. See, why didn't you choose that for the cover of the article?
Yeah. This is why nobody's going to legacy media. Mm-hmm. They don't lead with the hottest woman.
Well, exactly. I mean, you would think that's the logical choice. I mean, in media, it is a fact of the industry that sex sells, and an attractive woman on the cover or on the thumbnail, if you've clicked on this on YouTube, well,
sex sells. That's why Lotus Eaters is going.
Yeah, you better believe it. Right, so let's get into the meat of the story. So Kvitka Peherinets, who is this lady, a Ukrainian student at the University of Edinburgh, has been anxiously following the war in her home country from a distance. She told the BBC she was distressed by Professor Hayward's recent tweets, who is her professor. I'm not even sure if he's her professor, but he is a professor at University of Edinburgh. Days after a maternity hospital in Mariupol was bombed, Professor Hayward retweeted a Russian representative to the UN describing the attack as fake news. The tweet said the hospital has been controlled by the Ukrainian military and no patients were there. While one of Mariupol's maternity hospitals was no longer operational, the facility that had been bombed was a different one altogether and did contain patients. On learning this, Professor Hayward updated his Twitter thread. So he spread Russian disinformation, accidentally updated it afterwards. So that's what happened here.
Right, but he also says we should strive to hear both sides of the argument, and one of the sides is a literal dictator. So, I don't think we can give the same sort of weight and credibility to what's said by both sides. People say there's Ukrainian propaganda, and there's obviously going to be propaganda in a war, but it's coming from a relatively free country that's defending itself against a barbarian who's all this nonsense about defending themselves from NATO's never invaded Russia. It should invade Russia. It should, man. They should. I want us to conquest. We should bring back the British Empire and just take over. I'm amazed China hasn't done it. China needs Russia's oil and gas. We need Russia's oil and gas. We should meet China in the middle of Russia and divvy it up like we did with Berlin.
Yeah, unfortunately, Berlin didn't have nuclear weapons at the time, which adds a slight fly in the ointment.
Man, I'd be amazed if more than 10% of those nuclear weapons actually work. Having seen the rest of the Russian military.
So only about 1,600 then.
Is that, have they got
they've got the
16,000?
Yeah.
Man, yeah, but they got pound shop nuclear weapons. They don't have we've got proper nuclear weapons here. Man, they'll take out Swindon. That'll be an improvement. And that's it.
Well, yeah, that's certainly one perspective, but we continue here. So Professor Hayward continues, acquiring knowledge involves investigation, research and reasoning. If that's always going to be dismissed as disinformation, I think it's a very dangerous line to go down. But Kvitka said there are no two sides to the conflict. The moment we start to sort of equate the two sides in the story is the moment we lose our humanity, she said. The oppressor, in this case Russia, should not be given the same kind of platform as those who are being oppressed. And I actually agree with that on a level.
I agree.
Yeah, you do have to be a little bit sensitive to the issue at hand. However, I do think there is I think from the information I've been following, there's a lot of stuff is being retweeted and reposted uncritically from the Ukrainian side, which even the Ukrainians disavow a few days later. It's like, well, okay, if we trust the BBC for credibility, and believe it or not, some people still do, then they need to be doing better.
Yeah, we're seeing it with Ukraine took Snake Island, and so many things, and it means then when something does happen, like the Moskva gets sunk, then there's a lag in actually believing it.
Yes, absolutely. So you do have to be careful. Some things are true but sound false, and some things are false but sound true. And it's just part of this information war. But moving on, so as we have it here, in BBC World's latest hit piece against Tim Hayward, there was one important point about Kvitka that they didn't mention. They said she was a student without disclosing that she is alleged effectively state-funded. She's an author at the newspaper Kiev Independent. Which, as he says, was set up with money from the US and Canadian governments and the European Endowment for Democracy. So there is arguing that there's, from a funding source, a source of bias there. Now, I don't think this completely invalidates her statement. I think she was reasonably sensible on this occasion, though some of the stuff she puts out on Twitter is a bit more, untrue. But the problem here is that, this is actually a journalist who the BBC quoted as if she was a student. They just didn't even mention that at all. And I think that's very disingenuous. Yeah. If we continue, so we have Tim Hayward commenting on this.
I'm just Googling to see if there's any pictures of her on the beach.
So we have from Tim here, the BBC now attacks university professors, suggesting academic freedom should not be used to question Western justifications for war. In the US, Jimmy Dore raises this as a matter of concern, with Aaron J. Mate critically analysing the BBC's latest attack. And, if we skip over the next one and move on to truth defense. So past this one. So he's not the only academic to have been caught in the firing line with this line. We also have Dr. Justin Schlossberg here, research director and co-founder of Truth Defense, who's a senior lecturer in journalism and media at Birkbeck University of London. And his work is focused on media ownership, justice and disinformation. He's written several books about the media, and particularly about the BBC, including this next one, On Shaky Ground, the BBC in a Post-Consensus Age. And the abstract of this essentially research paper is as follows. This article reflects on the BBC's role in reshaping a hegemonic agenda consensus and offers a radical appraisal of its public service performance at a time of unprecedented political upheaval in the UK. This was in 2017. It draws on a recent case study to suggest that the BBC's overarching lean towards an elite and ideological worldview is increasingly exposed and can no longer be defended with recourse to notions of due impartiality.
Unprecedented political upheaval. I don't think 2017 was a time of unprecedented political upheaval.
Well,
We'd had Brexit, I suppose.
Exactly.
But that was it.
Right.
So, I mean, we decided to leave a sort of a sort of trade agreement framework. But, I mean, it's not exactly beheadings and
no, that's true.
New king.
we have had a lot more political upheaval in our history. That's pretty fair, yeah. But you must remember that this guy, reading between the lines, is a Jeremy Corbyn-leaning academic.
Yeah.
So I believe...
You can tell because he's an academic.
Nah, come on. Some of them are all right. They just keep it under their hat. But no, this guy, he's an interesting case study because he's written this article, which is essentially dead against the BBC, not from a, right-wing free speech perspective, but actually from a left-wing free speech perspective, that increasingly rare animal in political discourse.
Yeah.
And... how has the BBC reacted? Well, they have actually interviewed him and accused him of spreading Russian disinformation.
Right.
This is another disinformation media researcher who's being accused of disinformation. So we have this claim here. Last night, BBC Radio 4 aired a documentary which repeatedly accused me and other academics of spreading Russian disinformation. In a glaring and twisted irony, this amounted to an apparent smear operation that would not seem out of place on Kremlin media. Here's why. And he continues, in my case, the primary evidence offered for this grossly defamatory allegation was a thread I tweeted on the 4th of April in which I called for journalistic caution in reporting on the Bucha atrocities. And these are the comments he has. So let's talk about Bucha. Russian troops left on 30th of March, and I preface these are his comments at the time. No mention of any massacre or bodies lining the streets for 4 days. No mention in a video uploaded by Bucha's mayor on the 31st of March in which he celebrates liberation. No mention in an 8-minute video uploaded by local police on the evening of the 2nd of April discussing and showing their cleanup of the town. Responsible news outlets, including Reuters and the media in non-aligned countries, rightly reported claims of civilian massacre as alleged, along with Russia's response, which continued to report as foregone conclusion what no journalist or human rights group has yet been able to independently verify. To be clear, a civilian massacre may well have occurred, for which Russia should be held responsible and accountable, on top of other heinous war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine and elsewhere. But Western media must learn lessons of the past and avoid behaving exactly like their Russian counterparts, as stenographers of their governments rather than anything that could remotely be considered independent journalism. What do you think of those statements?
I don't know.
About what?
Well, I think. I think he's. Man, the thing is, like the UK, like we're not to say that the BBC is just an uncritical mouthpiece of the government is a nonsense.
Right. Okay. So if we continue, we'll skip over the next 2 links. So we get back to the next one. Yep. That one shouldn't be there, sorry. We go back to the thread reader app. That should have it there. Lovely. So he continues, the appeal for caution was predicated on the fact that widely reported claims at the time had not been substantiated and were not mentioned in recent posts. Rather than engage with the actual meaning of my tweets, the BBC chose to uncritically endorse obvious manipulation by people who have been actively trying to silence and delegitimize any dissenting viewpoints since the start of the Russian invasion. The manner in which the programme achieved this was so cynical and unguarded it beggars belief, even for those of us increasingly sceptical about the BBC's commitment to journalistic standards. For a start, my selectively quoted thread that was the focus of the programme's lead sequence included an explicit caveat, which we've read. In what can only be seen as a deliberate attempt to mislead, mention of this tweet was omitted, in spite of the seriousness of allegations made against me based on the content of the thread. The secondary evidence that the programme relied on relates to an allegation that I share material produced by Patrick Lancaster, who is embedded in a pro-Russian fighting unit and was accused early on in the conflict of reporting on an allegedly staged attack. Are you aware of Patrick Lancaster?
No.
So he's a guy who I am aware of, but I haven't really followed much of his work because he's been embedded with Russian separatist fighters for 8 years.
Right.
I would be very surprised if he's a neutral source.
And where does he publish?
He publishes on Twitter, on Telegram, and so on.
Right. Oh, but not for a sort of...
Yeah, I think he reported for Russia Today and probably still does.
Right.
Where people watch that.
Yeah, and Russia Today, obviously, state-funded propaganda.
Yes.
The overseas propaganda wing of the
Absolutely,
Russian government. Yeah, which I've actually been on.
Have you?
Yeah, I've been paid by them.
Oh, so you got
I take
those great old Putin bucks then.
Yeah. But I didn't... Because I was like, I knew it was like, because I did stuff with them with George Galloway, who have since fallen out with.
Oh, dear.
But I did stuff, and I was like, I'm aware that they exist to undermine Western liberal democracy. But the thing that I spoke about and wrote about was standing up for Western liberal democracy,
right,
and criticizing wokeism, which I consider. It's funny. All these, it's weird. The horseshoe of the left and right. So on the left, you got people trying to bring down Western liberal democracy, and because it's the empire and everything's racist in the West, and we must fill every country in Europe with lots of immigrants who are completely opposite, values and principles to us, to just bring down this, Western liberal democracy. And on the right, it's the same kind of thing. They're all sticking up for Putin, and but from a different angle. They think Putin, they admire Putin's strength and the sort of and also his. It's weird to admire Putin's strength when he's obviously so weak, and weird to sort of look at Putin and be like, oh well, he doesn't allow people in to undermine the country when he's using or to see him as some sort of bastion of Christendom.
Right.
When he's using Chechen Islamists, he's using Syrian Islamists. That he's busing in to do the fighting for him.
Well, Russia has a larger Muslim population than Britain, actually, by a substantial margin, which people don't seem to think about when they think of, as you say, Russia as a bastion of Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. But he continues. So perhaps worst of all, the programme uncritically featured commentary by former BBC journalist Paul Mason, who almost laughingly accused me and others of being Putin supporters based on the fact I've offered a critical perspective on some of the mainstream BBC coverage. This in spite of my obvious record of posting and publishing damning critiques of Putin's regime, especially in relation to disinformation, including several tweets since the start of the invasion and in 2017, long before Paul Mason showed much interest in Kremlin disinformation. I wrote that Russia Today's coverage is conditioned by an overarching narrative that is nothing more than a cynical exploitation and co-option of progressive discourse aimed ultimately at promoting the regressive and autocratic agenda of Putin, which is pretty much exactly what you said just there. Of course, Paul Mason is much more of a public figure than I am, making the BBC's wholesale failure to offer me any right of reply to his baseless allegations all the more egregious. And Paul Mason isn't the only one at the BBC. In a further ironic twist, the programme gives an unchallenged platform to Mariana Spring, the BBC's specialist disinformation reporter. There's a whole disinformation industry, isn't there?
Yeah.
Who accuses me of guilt by omission.
No, there really is a disinformation industry. And in fact, the woman who was heading up the disinformation board, what's her name? The one who sang the Mary Poppins song. Jankovic. Yeah. So she worked for a Ukrainian disinformation. Oh, what were they called? Stop Fake.
Yes,
something
right.
like that. Stop Fake. And they actually whitewashed Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups who committed pogroms, war crimes and pogroms against Roma, people in Ukraine. And you know, I'm all for, you know, I think Ukraine, if anything, is, you know, it's a European country that can sort of show the value. Because I think in the West we're very sort of down on ourselves, and we're like, oh no, we can't show any sort of national pride. We can't, you know, show any sort of resolve or, you know, pride in our values and our culture and all that sort of stuff. Whereas Ukraine is like, no, we're Ukrainian. We're standing up against Russia invading us. You know, we're not gonna let it happen. So there's, you know, Ukraine's showing the sort of value and the benefit and the positive side of nationalism, but flip side of that is there also, you know, there's some of the negatives of ultra-nationalism as well.
Well, I think it's possible to have nationalism without ultra-nationalism.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you kind of want to be in a way, slightly leaning that direction.
Yeah, and it's sort of weird to see the left, you know, jump on anything that happens in the UK. Anybody, you know, waves a flag or whatever, they're like, oh my God, this is fascism. This is literally fascism.
Yeah.
But in Ukraine, you got literal neo-Nazi groups committing pogroms, like killing people and stuff, and they're like, oh no, we need to cover this up because
that was silly.
Yeah.
And you get people who are just rabid on Twitter about how they will not wave the flag at all, and then they've got the Ukraine flag in their bios right now, and you're thinking, and next to an EU flag and some other flag, LGBT flag, and so on. But they'll never wave the flag. Goodness me. So I think this is a good... This story, the reason I'm bringing it up at length is it's a good example of what happens when someone like the BBC or mainstream media comes to you and they're like, yeah, we're interested in what you think, Leo. We want to hear all of your views. We're going to talk at length about your specialist subject. Then we're just going to report none of that and completely smear you.
Right.
So this is the way they continue. In the interview, he says, I made reference to the story fed to the Wall Street Journal by Bellingcat, which briefly dominated headlines before it was comprehensively debunked by both Ukrainian and US officials. Which was the story of Roman Abramovich getting poisoned by Russian secret agents.
Oh, is that fake?
Yes. And I included reference to this edition of Panorama on anti-Semitism in Corbyn's Labour, for which, according to him, there was a total failure of accountability. As a matter of practice, I always record such interviews for personal reference. And, oh my God, if you are being interviewed by the BBC, record it yourself.
Yeah.
Because otherwise that could come back to bite you. Listening back to the unedited audio, I was reminded of the producer's attempt to stop me discussing the Panorama episode on the basis that it wasn't relevant. This in the midst of a 2.5-hour interview in which I was repeatedly asked for examples of disinformation and propaganda in Western media, including the BBC. Now, if you think that's disinformation or not, that's entirely up to you, but this researcher does, and that's the point here. And in spite of its obvious relevance to a programme that attempts to critically examine my position that all media, to varying degrees, are vulnerable to disinformation, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Ridiculously insinuating that this position somehow lends credence to Kremlin propaganda. So this seems to be the argument. Oh, if you don't uncritically believe the BBC, then you are a Kremlin propagandist. It's like, how about they're both wrong? How about they're both lying? Obviously, that's not an equation of moral value. But come on, let's be real here. Everybody lies.
I don't lie.
Most honest man in the room.
Apart from when I click that box that says, I pay my TV license, let me watch BBC. I haven't paid my TV license in 17 years.
Yeah.
Nothing's ever happened.
You still get the letters like everyone else, I presume?
Don't even get the letters.
Wow. Fabulous. You must show me your trick sometime.
Oh, they came to, they actually sent a person to the door, and I answered the door hungover and in my underpants. And then the guy was like, it says you don't have a TV license or whatever. And I was like, oh, I don't use it for watching TV. I just use it for watching DVDs and playing Xbox. So come and have a look at it. I want to prove that it doesn't have any wires going in the back. He's like, no, I'll just put a note saying, like, you know, you don't use your TV.
That was cleverly done.
Yeah.
During the interview, he continues, the producer was overruled by the programme's presenter, Chloe Hadge, who pointed out with a wink that it was, in fact, relevant and that I should be given a chance to explain my views, though, of course, not sufficiently to be included in the programme. And this is where it gets worse. I subsequently attempted to engage with Chloe in polite and reflexive discussion of the programme's themes via email. I asked for her feedback on my analysis of the Panorama programme, which she promised, still waiting, and responded courteously to her follow-up questions. We even exchanged emails on the very day that, without mentioning it to me, she put grossly defamatory personal allegations about me directly to my employer, including this question. Is the university aware that Justin Schlossberg is sharing articles containing disinformation about the war in Ukraine and about coronavirus? And I should have put it in here, but there was a recent case with Andy No, which I think you've seen, where a journalist basically came to him with a load of, are you aware, defamatory statement. Are you also aware, another insult?
Yeah.
And can you comment on another? If a journalist says to you, are you aware that, be very wary. I think that's a fair conclusion.
Be very wary.
Indeed. I'm wary of it, to be honest. There we go. And he continues, but it does seem to me like the BBC is targeting people who are casting doubt on the BBC itself as disinformation sources. So there is kind of a disinformation war going here.
Yeah.
Your disinformation, no, your disinformation, no, your disinformation.
And this idea that you can have, groups that disinformation groups, and the online safety bill, which I think I spoke about last time I was on Lotus Eaters, is predicated on the idea that you can have these government or NGO groups that are tasked with finding out what the absolute truth is. And they decide what the truth is, and then anything that isn't that is disinformation. Anything that contradicts that is disinformation. And that's not a good way.
Absolutely.
You can't have an oracle of truth, because then who's funding them? What's their agenda?
But that's what fact checkers set themselves up to be, isn't it? It's like, well, this is the truth. And when they say mostly false or mostly true, those are exactly the same meaning. But they have a very different impact when you read it.
Yeah.
Mostly false and mostly true. The difference between those is a pure matter of opinion, right?
Yeah.
Everything could be right about your allegation except the color of lipstick that someone was wearing. It's like, mostly false. Why? Because the fact checker says so.
Yeah.
I'm really not a fan of fact checkers, I think, here in the studio, because even the idea of fact checking, the idea that there is just this one fact that you can dictate to the world that, oh yes, this is the case and this isn't, is quite shaky ground a lot of the time.
That statement is mostly false.
You heard it here first.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the Epoch series, this one between Carla Bow on the life of Pompey. If you want to find out what else we're bringing out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.